that was either in your data or in your methods or something like that. You wouldn't be referencing anything outside of your component. Sorry. So we have a similar setup. We have that string renderer. It's passing in the text, and the big thing to point out here is that we're in fact toggling that red class on and off. I really wanted to do the thing from Liar Liar. The pen is blue. I wonder if I joke for that. It's actually maybe better doing. This is green. Anyway, forms. So this is a place where things get a little different. We shift from how we've been talking about binding. In forms, and anyone familiar with Angular is familiar with the idea of model, which is a special thing that Angular came up with. So here we use the vModel directive instead of vbind. And what vModel actually is, it's a shorthand for doing a normal vbind to push your value down into, say, an input, and then an event that's also bound on it to push it back up. So it's a shorthand that wraps, it basically simulates two-way binding through a one-way binding down and an event up. And we can see this, there we go. So on the checkbox, we've got a vModel for check, which is part of our data. And in our input, we also have a vModel for message. And so we can actually see this stuff work. Every time I check and uncheck the box, that happens, it toggles true or false. And I can type messages in the box. And when I do vModel, we were talking about from inside of the input, pushing things out. But let's go ahead and push something down. We're seeing that. So, and so I can push down into it. So that means you could load some data directly into a form or something like that. Or you can let the user input into it, and that will get emitted in such a way that it will automatically end up back in your data. Pretty cool. I just want to get a gauge on time instead. Yeah, we're going to move over. I was afraid of this. Not enough. So let's talk about conditionals. We've got a couple of directives that show up here. We have a vIf, a vElse, and there's also a concept of vElseIf. But the idea here basically is that if it's checked, we should see yes. If it is not checked, we should see no. These two need to be right next to each other. They need to be sibling elements, or else it doesn't work. And they need to be in the correct order. So if you want to do if, else, they need to be, those three elements need to be in that order with the correct directives.
So you can't nest?
Not to my knowledge. They need to be, as far as I know, they need to be siblings. That'd be weird because if you nested and the if was here, the else was here, if this fails, then it disappears. The inner element disappears with the outer element. So, and then there's also a concept of vShow, and we'll take a quick look in the DevTools to see that. So, notice that when the check becomes true, vShow then makes that. Now you see me. Now you don't. But it's worth seeing something here to know. See what's going on. Let's go take a look at this. Notice, I don't know if you guys will be able to see it. Down here, you don't see the yes element. You only see the no. So vIf actually inserts and removes from the DOM, whereas if you look at now you see me, even though it's not there, we just have a display none. So things that you need to toggle frequently, but you're okay with leaving in the DOM, you might want to use vShow if you have complex conditions or something that you're rarely going to trigger in and out of the DOM. vIf would be preferred. The reason that you want to prefer vShow for frequent toggles is because it's a lot cheaper to apply a style than to do DOM manipulations to add and remove elements. So, Performance-wise, vShow is going to be better, but it doesn't have the flexibility of the if, else if, etc. Lists. So let's say you want to render out a list of things. This is useful for just about every application. Every application almost always ends up needing a list of something generated coming from a database. Use a v4 directive. You can put that on HTML elements, templates, or components. And the source of the list can be an array, an object, or a range. So the example of range would be like x and 5. We'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can also, we'll see an example here in a second, but if you need the index, there's a syntax for accessing the index. There's also an interesting syntax if you're binding to objects. It becomes item key value, I think, or something like that, or item key index. If you end up binding to an object and iterating over the properties, you'll need to take a look at the syntax for that. But basically, down here inside of our unordered list, we have some list items, and we're saying in items, so we look at data, we have an items property, we are referencing that directly here, and the end of our iterator variable, so if you're iterating over a collection, you say for x in names, for example, or n in names, item represents one of these items. And so we're simply just, since it's a list in our array of strings, we're just going to dump out those strings one at a time. This item can be an object though, for example, and then you could do, let's say each one of these was an object with a message property. You would do item.message. The only other thing that's worth noting, in the most recent version of Vue, 2.2, if you bind to, and the source list is, I believe if it's a component there, you now need to add a key property, a key binding, I should say, on this. So it would be :key equals something. It has to do with controlling, understanding which item in the list is which. One other thing that's worth noting here is that this v4 does not pass anything into a component. So if, again, using that example, let's say I wanted to pass, let's say this was instead of an li, it was a card, and we wanted to pass the message into it. Item has a message, and we want to pass it in. We would have to bind, say, :message equals, quote, message : or item.message : The idea is that we'd have to bind item message into some prop on the list item, or I guess we said card, on the card. So v4 just iterates them. If you want to bind in, that's still separate. So that's my to-do list for tonight. Finish this, go home, drink, go sleep. All right. All right, so two uses for events. We mentioned already passing data up to parent components. We're not going to get into that one tonight because it's far too deep a topic. Interactivity, though, is really interesting because we want to be able to click buttons and make stuff happen. So we bind methods to events with the v-on directive, and similar to kind of like v-bind, v-on : and then the event name and some method. There is a shorthand where you just put the @ symbol in front of it. So this one's really nice, just @click, @keyPress, @keyUp. And you'll notice you can either supply a method name, or an actual invocation. So you could have actually said some method, open close parentheses. Either one works. And component functions go into the methods property. So this is, pretend this was a larger component definition. You have a methods property, and each method is actually up there. And we'll try to make this brief. We've got a button with a click, there's pop-up. Pop-up just goes through and does a set timeout that triggers a show message. And with our conditional before, we should be showing a message of get off my lawn. Get off my lawn. All right. So that's how we make a button clickable, @click, and then call the thing you want it to click, actually want it to do, and there it goes. So slots. No, we're going to make this one real fast. I almost dropped this from the presentation. Most familiar with Angular, they call this transclusion. I don't know what React calls it, but the idea is basically, I keep bringing up card.
say you had a card, but it was just a generic thing. You want to be able to put anything you wanted in there. So you would say, let's say you wanted a card, and you want to be able to slide a card header and some other span in there. You make slots inside of the template. If you don't give it a name, it becomes the default slot. So if you just put one slot in there, you don't need to name it. That becomes whatever is the unnamed element in here. And then if you want multiple slots, you can name all but the default one. So you have a name one that's header, and that one automatically goes to the top, then the default one goes second. You can make a footer one underneath that. One thing that's really important to understand about slots, all template expressions are evaluated against the matching component instance. What this means is that this message right here, so, what's tricky about this is, if you saw this markup, you'd actually be in a component that is neither card nor card header. This message would be bound against whatever component you were currently defining. That makes sense? Message is not bound, so message is not evaluated against the data of card or of card header. It's of whatever template is, whatever. If this was your root view instance, for example, you would be looking for a message on the data object of that root view instance, not of card or card header. Does that make sense?
Is it case sensitive?
What's that?
Is it case sensitive?
Message? There, yes. One of the, keep in mind, because message is just one of the properties on data. Or technically it's so what's worth noting there is, in this case, since we're binding to a thing like message, it's probably in data, but there's a possibility that it's actually computed or that it is a method, although you would probably, since this is evaluating expressions, what you would get probably there is actually the function body spit out into the DOM. It would be really gross. It would be really weird. So, this is a list of the stuff that I didn't cover. So there's a lot of stuff to read. What I've given you here should be enough for you to go home and to do MVC, a Twitter app, some basic web application, and enough to get started and understand why I think Vue is cool, and why, in my opinion, this is, it's Angular without the hard parts, and React without the hard parts. It's got all the performance of React, all the fun, all the easiness of Angular's templates, but we didn't have to figure out dependency injection. We didn't have to figure out JSX. We just got to write a template, write some code, make some styles, bam, it works. Things that are worth noting here, we've talked about lifecycle hooks a couple times already, and filters. Custom directives, you can actually define your own, kind of like von and vbind, you can actually define your own those. Render functions, this is where we get into things like using JSX. And deployments, obviously, we're looking at unless you don't have a plan to show us that anyway. All right, Vuex. 10 minutes. I think we can do it. No, Vuex, we've done the hard part, honestly. There's a few conceptual hard parts here, but using Vuex is far simpler than trying to explain all of them. So I'm just going to read this straight from the Vue book because it's better than the description I could do. Vuex is a state management pattern and a library for Vue applications. It serves as a centralized store for all the components in an application, with rules ensuring that the state can only be mutated in a predictable fashion. That's an important part there. It also integrates with Vue's official dev tools extension to provide advanced features such as zero config time traveling, debugging, and state snapshot export and import. If we have a second, I do want to go back and show you guys the dev tools because they're really dope. It's worth noting, though, the idea for Vuex came from Facebook's Flux pattern. The most popular implementation of Flux is Redux. Another good one that's well known is MobX. But basically the idea is that you have a one-way flow. You can never go back the other direction. So an action happens, it gets passed into a dispatcher, the dispatcher mutates the store, which then, through the magic of reactivity in either React or in Vue, we end up generating a whole, an updated copy of our Vue. And if you want to do things like button clicks, your action goes back to the dispatcher, and you always are rendering this way. So Vuex. So you'll notice this is fairly similar. We have an action, we dispatch an action, and we end up with state, we render. So this step being the render. There's your dispatch. This diagram is really useful because it points out where a few other things happen, but we'll talk about that. So the idea, basically, your components dispatch an action. They can also, technically, they can actually jump straight this way. They can directly commit a mutation. Mutations do state changes. Super important. This is also because one of the things that the designers of Vue did, they said, let's not make our libraries ignorant of the other things in our ecosystem. So Vue knows about Vuex, and Vuex knows about the dev tools. And Vue knows about the dev tools, and it's willing to give up information, and then it all work nicely together. So they decided to be a little bit opinionated about things, and that's great. So bootstrapping, we go ahead and create a store from the vuex.store. It's going to have the main four properties will be state, getters, mutations, and actions, and we'll go through all the getters because I don't find them that useful personally. But state, basically, we put in a message. We went ahead and bound to our element up there. I'm referencing the store. This is one of the magic pieces of Vuex. We can register the store in our root Vue instance, and it gets automatically injected into all of our components and contexts as $store. It's worth noting that remember that templates are evaluated against a root Vue instance or a component. So from inside of a component, you would say this $store.state.message. If you were inside of the component or this kind of thing. So we have our store. You have to register it into the root Vue instance. So that means store comes like global registration of components. Store creation has to happen for creation of the root Vue instance. State. So this is a tree that acts as the single source of truth for the state of your app. Think about the easiest way I can think about how to explain this and why it's valuable. Think of the most rudimentary piece of programming. It's a function, right? And we pass things into functions and things come out of functions. Think of your Vue app as a function. Vuex is the single argument to that function, and what your users see is the output. And every time you make a change to the argument, the function reevaluates and they get a view. You change the state, reevaluate, they get a view. So that means that as long as your function, your application doesn't have any weird side effects, is not non-deterministic, there's no math randoms in it and things like that. Every time you put in the same store tree, you will get out the same output. It makes it very easy to know that there's a reliability of your application, and that makes it easier to test because there's no state stored inside the application. Now you can technically still do that, and that's what the data object or data function is. It's local state inside your components, but generally speaking, anything that needs to be shared around, that stuff should be in your store or in your state in the store. State is reactive, so just like data and computed, when you change something in the store, if it's bound, I could have done the example in the last one, but we're running out of time, it would live update. So I could have changed that message in the store, it would have live updated in what was rendered. There is a map state helper that helps you turn state properties into computeds though in your components. So the idea here is, I'll highlight the bottom one here. Basically, our store had that message in our last slide. I can go ahead and say map state, and now there will be a message property inside my computeds. So if I were to put this in here into this root Vue instance, I could just go message up here instead of $store state message. So you can map these store things right into your components and make them easy to use so you're not having to litter your templates with this kind of garbage. First rule of Vuex. Don't change the store outside of, or don't change state from outside of the store. That's what mutations are for. In order for Vuex to do its job, all the mutations go through the store's mutation section. And mutations are committed. So you have a syntax store.commit. You give a mutation name and a value to commit, or you can do it as an object. The mutation name becomes a type property. It must be called type. That is a requirement there. This can be whatever you want to call it. Value, amount, message, my silly property. I really don't care what you call it. It does change how you access it inside of the mutation function, though. Similar to map state. We're going to do this again. Similar to map state, there is for each of these sections for maps, for state, getters, mutations, and actions, there's a map helper. There's a way to do that. The syntax is very similar, although map mutations maps them into methods instead of into computers. Mutations must be synchronous. This is because if you do something async, the mutation, the wrappers around mutations won't know that state has changed. If after you come back from the async function, you went and changed state, it has no way of tracking that because you're outside of the context now. So mutations must be synchronous. And a best practice, use constants for your mutation names. You can put those in a separate file because if you try to run, like if you want to go commit a mutation for one of your components, you can import that list of constants. And then if you want to go rename one of those constants with a nice IDE, all that, all of its magic, you can do that kind of thing. You can also track the usages of that better than if you just use string. All right, quick look at mutations. We have state and account. I pretty much ripped this straight out of docs. It's a little bit of a change. We have an increment with a state payload. Payload has an amount, so I'm using that object style commit syntax down here. I went ahead, I didn't do the map mutations concept, I just went ahead and wrote it myself here. And we use it in 2 different ways. So whatever value we take in, we pass in here. So payload will get this whole object. Payload.amount will be, so whatever goes into this increment function will be what's an amount. And to prove to you that this whole idea works, +1, +10, hey, it's pretty cool. So, yeah, that works. I want to make sure you guys get it. Second rule of Vuex, don't change state from outside of the store. All right. Actions, if you need to do multiple actions to get, or multiple mutations together, or if you need to do async stuff, do an AJAX request and then maybe commit that whatever comes back from that into the store, actions are used to coordinate mutations and asynchronous operations. Actions are dispatched, not committed. Use store.dispatch. It's basically the same thing. I left that marker in that. Good. It's basically the same syntax as commit, just with the dispatch instead of commit. And I don't remember. Oh, the whole point here was that in a mutation we could not asynchronously, through a set timeout, we could not asynchronously commit. The other thing that's worth noting is you get a context here instead of, here we got state. So we got access to state here. We get context here, it's similar, so you still have commit, you have access to the state itself, but this is similar to, that's store, sorry, typo. Context is similar to your store, not your state, it's similar to your store. So you can call commit, you can have access to state, you can have access to certain things, but we're almost there. Almost there. We good to power through? So the idea here is we can go ahead and do async. So you want to read the docs to understand the difference between store and context, but it has to do with modules, which are not covering, so I'm not covering it. So one last thought on this diagram. Actions are very important because let's say you want to be able to do like AJAX requests and stuff like that. Let's say when your app loads, you want it to automatically go grab some data and shove it into your store. Actions are how you do it. You make some API JavaScript file, you call into that right at the beginning of your app and run some async operation, take the results of that and shove it into your store through an action, and now that automatically propagates into your application. Anytime you want to do additional things even from your components, your @click, the handler for your click. You can go ahead and make that, import that API file, make a call to a particular API method, goes out, does its thing, and the result when that comes back in its callback, you dispatch an action, and it shoves stuff into the store, and through the magic of reactivity, your whole app re-renders only the chunks that need to be re-rendered, and fast, awesome DOM changes happen, and everybody's happy. One last thought. Application structure. That is like the last major actual slide of content. We talked about Vue model, how that was a wrapper around props down, events up kind of concept. So we talked about what are the first and second rules of Vuex. Anybody tell me?
Definitely change the state.
Shut up. Don't change the state from outside the store. Well, Vue model would totally violate that if you needed to change. If you found something that was in the store into a Vue model, you'd be violating that because it would try to change that directly. So our computer properties, I didn't get a chance to mention it earlier, but they have, you can do a computer property that's just a function, and that makes it a getter only. So that's the default action, the default style of computers. But you can also define them as with getters and setters. And so we basically can make a computed property that wraps around the retrieval and committing of a state property, and that allows us to shove things in and out of the state. So if I go ahead and do that, and take it right away. State, sorry. So I made a change up here, and I went and peeked inside the store, and sure enough, that ASDF is on there. Actually, running out of time, but I promised Vuex Dev Tools. So you can see in here, it's hard to probably remember. You can see all of my various components and whatnot in here. If I can find it. Yeah, here we go. So here is my last and final. All of these groups represent all of the different Vuex apps that I've embedded inside this presentation. You can see right here my message. We can go ahead and peek inside the Vuex store as I make changes. Let's go back. Try to grab my presenter like it was. Watch that message change. We can rewind and fast forward in time. So you have significant power using these dev tools. There's also an events tab and whatnot. So you have some significant power. You can even like import whole chunks of state and things like that. So the Chrome dev tools are a huge help when you're trying to debug weird issues. One last. Application structure, a couple things worth noting. Usually, what happened here? Totally mad about this. So underneath store, you should know all this. If you're building a really complex app, you'll want to have an index.js inside your store that basically imports your actions. And this is all jacked up. What happened here? Imports your actions, mutations, etc. Your mutation types being in a separate file. Then inside of components, you have the whole thing is bootstrapped in main.js, and the only thing main.js should do is load your base component, which is usually called app.vue. And then app.vue takes it from there, basically. Things we missed in Vuex: getters, modules, strict mode, plugins, and hot reloading. I don't like getters only because, I don't like any other getter, but you can't pass something into them. Like if you wanted to filter a list, you can only get the list back and then filter it externally. I really wanted to be able to be like, yeah, give me this thing but filter it this way. So I don't like it. Thanks for listening. I know we're out of time. Does anyone have any quick questions? If not, I'll stick around and answer questions. I apologize for keeping people late. And at the end here, I have included some resources. Awesome Vue is a big collection of resources. Quasar is a great framework for getting components like data tables and nice checkboxes and good-looking buttons and all that stuff. There is a guide for all of these things, and obviously if you want to make a full-fledged spa with different routes and stuff, and link routers, the router, and you should go take a look at the book. If you understood the presentation tonight, you should not have too much trouble understanding the Vue router. It's of the three things, Vue, Vuex, and Vue router is the easiest to understand out of the three. So if you rocked everything I said tonight, or well enough that you feel like you can go read the docs and whatnot, you'll be fine. Thanks for listening. Cool. Thanks, guys.
Just one quick question I was going to ask. Vue being so much smaller than Angular and React, is there anything you're losing, or is it just better written code?
The one big critique that I would have, like if I had to say I've lost something here, is it's at being a younger project, its ecosystem is still evolving. So things like component libraries, like one of the things I loved about Angular was the number of libraries available for it, particularly like the Angular UI team, built tons of stuff. Their UI table, or UI grid, that's what it was one of the best data tables I've ever worked with. You had to literally read a book to use it, but you know, it was fantastic. So we're still seeing that. We're still in the early stages of that adoption and tool, you know, other tooling being built out. But that said, I have seen a couple of decent frameworks. The only other thing that's a challenge is that for us, and honestly, we have enjoyed this privilege for a long time as English-speaking developers. Avenue is Chinese and is heavily adopted. I believe it's Chinese, and this has been heavily adopted by a number of Chinese companies. And so there are a number of libraries that are built and they're essentially all their documentation in Chinese. So you will find some of the things in that, like in that awesome Vue list that are like, you go to the page and it's just like, I don't read Chinese. If you read Chinese, you're fine. Like, you're totally good. But I don't. And I was like, will translate this page? Yes. And even that, you know, so that's one of the struggles. That said, there are a large number of resources available in English. If you speak anything other than English and Chinese, I can't help you. That's the two main languages, things written, documented, and all that good stuff. But yeah, I don't feel like I lost anything significant, and I feel like I gained a lot in terms of ease of use and speed to building. It was far easier for me. Maybe it's just I played with enough frameworks by now that I get all the concepts. So it's probably a piece of that, but I felt like this was far easier to learn than any framework, any front-end framework that I've ever had